Imagine taking the most exclusive, fiercely protected titles of an ancient nation.
Right.
Titles that were, bought with blood, centuries of history, and divine covenants.
Yeah.
And then just giving them away to total outsiders.
It sounds crazy.
It does.
Right.
But that is what a fisherman named Peter did 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And people are still arguing about the consequences today.
They absolutely are.
So, welcome to a new deep dive on Reformed thinking. You might think a letter written in the first century has little bearing on current events. But how we interpret these specific verses dictates how millions of people understand prophecy, the church, and the future of ethnic Israel.
It is a massive topic.
It really is. Today, our mission is to uncover how the Apostle Peter took ancient descriptions of the nation of Israel and applied them to a mostly Gentile Christian audience. And we want to see what that means for you, the listener, regarding how to read your Bible.
Yes.
Our primary source for this discussion is a detailed academic essay by W. Edward Glenny. It's titled The Israelite Imagery of 1 Peter 2.
It is a phenomenal piece of scholarship.
Okay, let's unpack this. We cannot grasp the weight of Peter's letter without understanding the intense pressure his original readers were under. So can we set the stage and look at what was happening in Asia Minor during the first century?
Yeah, absolutely. To understand what Peter is doing in this text, we have to recognize who he is addressing and the crushing realities they face every day.
Right.
So 1 Peter is directed to a predominantly Gentile Christian audience. They are scattered across regions like Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia.
And we know for sure they are Gentiles, right?
Yes, we do. We know they are Gentiles from several distinct clues in the text. Peter references their past lives in ignorance, their futile ways inherited from their forefathers, and their previous involvement in lawless idolatry.
Ah, I see. Those are very specific markers.
Exactly. I mean, those are standard Jewish descriptions of the pagan world. A Jewish writer wouldn't describe fellow Jews that way. But here is the critical issue. These believers are facing severe social ostracization.
Because they stepped away from the culture.
Right. In the Greco-Roman world, religion and civic life were completely intertwined. There was no separation of church and state.
Right, it was all one big system.
So if you withdrew from the pagan festivals or the temple sacrifices or even just the local guild banquets because of your new faith in Christ, you were viewed as a subversive threat.
You were basically a danger to the social order.
Spot on. You would lose your livelihood, your friends, and, well, often your family. This intense daily suffering is likely causing these early Christians to really question things.
Question their faith entirely, I would imagine.
Yeah, they are asking themselves if their election by God is real. They are wondering if the gospel message they bank their lives on is actually valid.
Because everything around them is screaming that they made a huge mistake.
Yes. So to comfort and stabilize them in the midst of this chaos, Peter does something fascinating. He takes the central concept of Israel's self-understanding.
Which is what, specifically?
Their unique historical status as the elect people of the Creator. And he transfers that status directly to these marginalized Gentile believers.
What?
Yeah. He uses Old Testament texts that originally spoke exclusively about the physical descendants of Abraham, and he applies them to these newly planted churches.
This creates a huge theological puzzle, doesn't it?
It does. It has massive implications for how we view redemptive history.
I have to admit, I am struggling to see how Peter gets away with this. I mean, if I just take someone else's historical title, a title they have held for centuries, and claim it for myself or my friends, that is basically identity theft.
It kind of looks that way on the surface.
How is Peter not just committing theological identity theft here? If you read the Old Testament, terms like a chosen people and a holy nation are strictly reserved for ethnic Israel.
Yes, they are.
How does Peter justify taking titles given to Israel at Mount Sinai under terrifying displays of lightning and smoke and handing them over to non-Jewish people living hundreds of miles away in Asia Minor? It is a staggering theological move.
It is a massive shift. But Glenny argues that Peter's method of interpreting the Old Testament provides the answer.
Okay.
He says Peter is not claiming the church has simply replaced Israel. And he is not saying these verses were a direct, exclusive prophecy that completely bypassed the original Jewish audience.
So he's not ignoring the original context.
Not at all. Instead, Peter is utilizing a specific, highly structured framework.
So what is the precise method Peter uses to bridge this massive gap? How does he connect the ancient nation of Israel and the first century church without erasing the original meaning?
The method Glenny identifies is called a typological-prophetic interpretation.
Typological-prophetic.
Yeah, it is a highly specific hermeneutical approach. It basically means Peter is looking at the broad sweep of history and seeing a recurring divine pattern.
A pattern. That makes sense.
And we have to clarify, typology is very different from allegory.
How so?
Well, allegorical interpretation often searches for hidden, mystical, or disconnected spiritual meanings behind the text. It sometimes ignores what actually happened in history.
Like treating the text as just a fable or a myth.
Right. Typology, on the other hand, relies completely on historical facts. It deals with real people, real kings, real battles, and real institutions.
It stays grounded in reality.
Completely. It recognizes that the Creator works in consistent, escalating patterns throughout salvation history. According to Glenny, there are 4 necessary components to this typological prophetic method.
Okay, let's hear them.
Understanding these is crucial for reading the text correctly. First, as I mentioned, the Old Testament type must be rooted in actual historical facts. It cannot be a myth.
Okay, step 1 is historical reality.
Got it. Second, there must be a clear, identifiable scriptural link connecting the original Old Testament event, which we call the type, to the New Testament event, which is the antitype.
So the connection has to be in the text itself.
Yes, the connection must be textual, not just a product of our imagination. Third, there has to be a clear correspondence existing between the 2 events.
What do you mean by correspondence?
The same divine logic, the same mechanism of salvation or judgment must be visibly operating in both situations.
I see. The underlying principle has to match.
Right. And fourth, and this is the most critical component, there must be an escalation or a heightening.
From the old to the new.
Yes. From the lesser Old Testament type to the greater New Testament reality, it is never just a flat repetition of history. It is an advancement.
That is a great distinction.
The New Testament fulfillment is always grander, more expansive, and more spiritually weighty than the Old Testament type that preceded it.
I love how structured that is. Think of it like a renowned architect who builds a beautiful, fully functional, single-story house.
Okay, I like this.
That house is the Old Testament type. It's a real building, people actually live in it, and it provides legitimate shelter.
Right, it does a real job.
Years later, that exact same architect uses the exact same design language, the same structural patterns, and the same aesthetic principles to build a massive, towering skyscraper.
Ah, I see where you're going.
That skyscraper is the New Testament escalation. Now, the existence of the skyscraper does not mean the original single-story house never existed.
Right, it doesn't invalidate it.
It does not mean the original house was a mistake. Both are real. Both are designed by the same mind. But the skyscraper shows the architect's pattern operating on a much grander, elevated scale.
That is a brilliant analogy.
The creator is the architect here, and he is taking the patterns he established with Israel and escalating them in Christ and the church.
Yes, that hits the nail on the head.
So, with this typological prophetic blueprint in mind, how does Peter actually apply this in the text of his letter? Let's look at the first half of the passage in 1 Peter chapter 2.
Okay.
This section focuses heavily on these quotations about a stone. How does he organize these thoughts for his readers?
Peter applies this blueprint using a recognized literary and exegetical structure. He utilizes a rabbinic method known as gezerah shawa.
Gezerah shawa.
Right. This was a well-known rule of interpretation in the 1st century, often associated with the famous Rabbi Hillel.
Oh, Rabbi Hillel. Very influential figure.
Extremely influential. The rule essentially states that you can interpret one passage of Scripture by another if both passages share a common, unique keyword.
Like linking concepts through a specific word.
Yes. By placing the texts side by side based on this shared word, the meaning of one illuminates the other. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, the linking keyword is stone.
Which is lithos in Greek, right?
Correct, lithos. Peter gathers 3 distinct Old Testament verses that use this exact word and strings them together to build an argument.
But he doesn't just list them randomly.
No, he does not just list them back to back like a catalog. He includes a running commentary between the quotes.
So he's explaining as he goes.
Right. This is known as a midrashic style. He weaves his own theological explanations directly into the sequence of the Old Testament citations.
Guiding the reader along.
Yes, guiding the reader on how to connect the ancient text to their present reality. By doing this, he establishes a concrete theological base.
Where does he start?
He starts with Christology, focusing entirely on Jesus as the ultimate stone before he ever says a word about the church.
Wait, let me make sure I am grasping this. So Rabbi Hill's rule, this Gezerah Shawa, is basically like using a search engine today.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it.
If I hit CTRL plus F and search the word stone, across the whole Old Testament, Peter is taking the top 3 search results, putting them on the same page, and saying, look at the pattern the architect is using here.
Yes, that makes perfect sense for a first-century mind.
That brings up the first quotation in his sequence, which is Isaiah 28.16. In this text, Isaiah talks about a tested stone laid in Zion.
Right.
When you read the original context of Isaiah 28, it is quite intense. Isaiah is delivering a stern warning to the leaders of Judah.
Very stern.
They are facing a massive military threat from the Assyrian war machine. The northern kingdom is falling, panic is in the air, and instead of trusting the Creator for protection, these leaders are panicking.
They're completely losing their grip.
And Isaiah specifically describes them as drunken, right? They're busy trying to forge political alliances with foreign nations like Egypt.
Yeah, they think their clever treaties will save them from being wiped out.
Into that political panic, the prophet says that God is laying a stone in Zion, a secure foundation, and whoever believes or trusts in it will not be put to shame.
That is the promise.
In that ancient geopolitical context, what was that tested stone supposed to be?
In that original historical context, the tested stone laid in Zion referred to the Davidic monarchy.
The king's lineage.
Yes, Zion is Jerusalem, the geographical seat of the Davidic throne. Isaiah was reprimanding the political leaders for making worthless, frantic covenants with pagan nations.
Because God had already made a covenant with them.
Right, God had already established an unshakable covenant with King David. Decades prior, God had promised David a secure house or dynasty that would endure forever.
I see.
The Davidic monarchy was the cornerstone upon which God was building his redemptive program for Israel.
So the message to the leaders was to trust that promise.
Exactly. The message from Isaiah was that anyone who rightly related to God and trusted in the promises made to the line of David would be secure. They would be safe regardless of the Assyrian army marching toward their borders.
Okay, so that historical situation is the type.
Right. But Peter applies the typological-prophetic escalation. He takes Isaiah 28.16 and applies it directly to Jesus.
Because Jesus is the ultimate Davidic king.
Yes. Jesus is the ultimate escalated fulfillment of the Davidic line. He is the final Davidic king.
So Peter quotes this to show Jesus is the completion of that pattern.
Correct. By quoting this, Peter is showing that Jesus is the completion of that divine prophetic pattern. The security that the ancient Judeans were supposed to find in the earthly Davidic throne is now found in its highest and most absolute form by trusting in Jesus the Messiah.
The house has become the skyscraper.
The house has absolutely become the skyscraper.
That makes the pattern so vivid. The security is no longer just about surviving an ancient siege. It is about eternal survival.
Right. It is a massive upgrade.
That leads us right into the second quote Peter pulls from his search results, which is Psalm 118.22. This is the famous verse saying, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone."
A very famous text.
When we look at Psalm 118 in its original Old Testament setting, we see it as a psalm of thanksgiving.
Yes.
It was likely sung by an Israelite king celebrating a major military victory after a season of intense vulnerability.
Right. The king was in serious trouble.
This king, representing the whole nation, had been deemed worthless and cast aside by the superpowers of the day. But God delivered him and exalted him.
That is the dynamic.
You have this dynamic of total rejection by human powers, followed by absolute exaltation by God.
That is right. And the imagery here is striking. The builders, in the original context of Psalm 118, were the empire builders of the ancient Near East.
Like the massive geopolitical superpowers.
Yes, we are talking about Egypt, Assyria, or Babylon. Nations that controlled the destinies of lesser nations.
They were building their empires.
Right. They looked at the king of Israel and considered him insignificant, a flawed stone not worth using in their grand designs for global dominance.
They just tossed him aside.
But God took that rejected stone and made it the cornerstone, the most vital structural piece of the building that determines the alignment of every other stone.
And then Peter points out how that pattern repeats.
The pattern repeats with blinding clarity in the New Testament, but with a massive escalation. Jesus is the antitype.
He was the rejected stone.
Yes. He was rejected not just by the Roman Empire builders, but specifically by the religious builders of his own day, the local authorities who were supposed to be constructing the spiritual life of the nation.
They cast him aside completely.
He was crucified, cast aside as entirely worthless and shameful, yet God exalted him through the resurrection, making him the absolute cornerstone of the new spiritual temple.
So the pattern of rejection by men and exaltation by God is identical to the Old Testament type.
It is identical, but the scale moves from an ancient, localized political victory to the eternal salvation of humanity and the defeat of death itself.
That is a huge escalation.
It is. Peter uses this to show his persecuted readers that Christ's rejection was not an accident or a failure. It was the precise fulfillment of an established divine pattern.
And then Peter hits us with the third quote, which brings a very sober, heavy warning.
It does.
He quotes Isaiah 8:1, talking about a stone that causes men to stumble and a rock that makes them fall.
Right.
In the original setting of Isaiah 8, the prophet tells the people of Israel that Yahweh Almighty is the one they should fear. God says he will be a sanctuary for some, but for others in Israel, he will be a stone that causes them to stumble.
It is a terrifying image.
The people of Israel were literally stumbling over God himself because of their disbelief and their desire to handle things their own way. How does Peter take this image of a stumbling stone and escalate it in his letter?
The escalation here is a breathtaking theological elevation. In the Old Testament text, the people stumbled over Yahweh himself.
Right.
In Peter's letter, the people who disbelieve the gospel stumble over Jesus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. By taking an Old Testament text that explicitly describes the actions of Yahweh and applying it directly to Jesus, Peter is creating an undeniable link between them.
He's basically saying Jesus is God.
He is indicating that Jesus shares the divine identity. The stone that saves those who believe is the exact same stone that crushes those who refuse to believe.
The stone itself doesn't change.
The nature of the stone does not change. The difference is entirely in how a person approaches it.
That is a really sobering thought.
Furthermore, Peter notes that the stumbling is appointed for those who disobey the message. This highlights the sovereign purpose of God, even in the face of human rebellion and unbelief.
So it isn't an accident.
Not at all. The failure of the surrounding culture to believe in Jesus does not mean God's plan is falling apart. Rather, it is fulfilling the very pattern outlined in Isaiah.
That would be huge comfort to the readers.
This was meant to offer immense comfort to Peter's readers. They were watching their neighbors, their former friends, and their family members mock Christ and persecute the church.
And Peter's saying, this was expected.
Yes. Peter is reassuring them that this hostile reaction is not a surprise to God. It is an entirely expected component of the biblical pattern.
I have to pause here and ask a critical question on behalf of the listener.
Sure.
If these Old Testament verses were originally talking about ancient kings, national defense, and historical battles from centuries past, how on earth did Peter's first-century readers know he was talking about Jesus?
That is a great question.
Did Peter just invent this stone equals Messiah connection on the spot? Or was there some precedent in the ancient world for reading these specific passages this way? It seems like a massive leap to assume a Gentile audience would track with this heavily Jewish method of argument.
That is a highly perceptive question, and it gets to the heart of how the early church understood their own scriptures. Peter did not invent this connection out of thin air.
Okay, so it was already established.
Yes. He was building on a robust tradition where these specific verses were already understood as messianic within Judaism.
Do we have proof of that?
We do. We have evidence from ancient Jewish writings, such as the Targums.
What are the Targums?
They were Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew scriptures read aloud in the synagogues, and they clearly interpret these passages through a messianic lens.
Oh, so the average synagogue goer would have known this.
Right. Similarly, documents discovered at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, show that the stone imagery was widely accepted as a reference to the coming deliverer. First-century Jews were already looking for a stone.
That is fascinating context.
Furthermore, and most importantly, Jesus himself explicitly quoted Psalm 118 during his earthly ministry.
Really? When did he do that?
During the final week of his life, he applied the concept of the rejected stone directly to his own impending death at the hands of the religious leaders and his subsequent vindication.
So Jesus gave them the interpretive key.
Yes. So Peter is utilizing an interpretive tradition that was established by Christ and recognized by anyone familiar with the Jewish roots of the faith.
Even the Gentiles in his audience would have been taught this.
Right. He is taking the established messianic hope, a hope his readers had been taught when they first heard the gospel, and firmly anchoring it in the historical reality of Jesus.
Here is where it gets really interesting. We have just walked through this dense, rich Christology.
Yeah, it is heavy stuff.
Peter has established Jesus as the tested stone from Isaiah 28, the rejected but exalted cornerstone from Psalm 118, and the stumbling stone from Isaiah 8.
The foundation is set.
He has built the foundation. But then Peter makes a massive theological pivot. He shifts from talking about Jesus, which we call Christology, to talking about the listener, which we call ecclesiology.
He turns it right to the audience.
He turns his attention from the invincible cornerstone to the actual people sitting in those house churches in Asia Minor. How does he bridge that gap?
It is a brilliant move.
How do we get from a discussion about the eternal Messiah to a discussion about the status of a persecuted peasant reading a letter?
The bridge connecting the stone, which is Jesus, and the people, which is the church, is a single vital theological concept: election.
Election, okay.
Throughout this entire passage, Peter emphasizes that Jesus is the elect stone, chosen by God before the foundation of the world.
Right.
Because believers are united with Christ through faith, they share completely in his status. They become an elect people.
So his status becomes their status.
There is a direct, unbreakable transfer of attributes from Christ to the believer. Because Jesus is elect, you are elect. Because Jesus is holy, you are called to be holy.
Because Jesus is an acceptable sacrifice, you are granted the ability to offer acceptable spiritual sacrifices.
Exactly. The connection is rooted entirely in the believer's corporate union with the Savior.
That union is the key.
This concept of election is the engine driving the entire passage. It guarantees that the privileges, the security, and the status granted to the Messiah flow downward continuously to those who belong to him.
That transfer of status brings up a fascinating translation insight from Glenny's essay regarding verse 7.
Yeah, this is a crucial detail.
In many modern English Bibles, 1 Peter 2.7 is translated to say something like, "To you who believe, this stone is precious."
Right. That is how most of us hear it.
When we hear that in modern English, it sounds like an expression of our subjective feelings toward Jesus. It sounds like a hymn stating that we find him dear to our hearts or that we have warm emotions about him.
It sounds very internal.
But Glenny points out that the Greek word used there, tira, carries a very different weight in the ancient world.
It really does.
He argues it translates far better to the concept of honor or privilege.
Yes, that is a highly significant nuance that changes the entire tone of the verse. Translating time as precious in a subjective, emotional sense misses Peter's primary objective.
So Peter isn't talking about their feelings.
Peter is not describing the internal affections of the believers. He is stating an objective theological fact about their status in the universe.
Okay, tell me more about that.
In the ancient Mediterranean world, society was built entirely on a shame and honor culture. Your worth was determined by how the community viewed you.
And the community viewed these Christians as shameful.
Peter's readers were drowning in public shame. They were disgraced outcasts. Therefore, the text is actually saying, therefore, the honor and privilege belongs to you who believe.
Wow, that flips it entirely.
Think about the flow of the argument. The stone, Christ, is chosen by God and highly honored in the heavenly places, despite being publicly shamed and rejected by men on earth.
Right.
Therefore, the believers who align themselves with this stone share in that exact same objective honor.
Even if the world thinks otherwise.
Even though they are currently despised, mocked, and rejected by their pagan neighbors, in the eyes of God, the supreme judge, they possess the highest possible honor.
That is a total game changer.
It is a declaration of their unshakable standing before the Creator, not just a description of their feelings.
If you are listening to this and you have ever felt completely alienated, maybe you have been pushed out of your workplace for your convictions, or you feel like an outcast in your own family, Peter's use of this word is aimed right at your chest.
It is so relevant.
When society treats you like garbage, it is very easy to start questioning your own value and your status before God. The natural human reaction is to think, if God favors me, why is my life so hard? Why is the culture so against me?
We all ask those questions.
Peter writes this letter to assure those first-century believers and to assure you that your union with Christ grants you supreme honor right now, regardless of the hostility around you.
Yes.
Your status is not determined by the shifting opinions of the culture. It is determined by how God treats the stone, Jesus Christ. Because he is permanently honored, you are permanently honored. That is a radically stabilizing truth for anyone going through the fire.
It provides absolute security. It gives them a place to stand when the cultural ground is giving way.
And having established that believers share in the honor and election of Christ, Peter is now ready to explain exactly what that looks like in practice.
Yes, he moves right into application.
This leads him to the second group of Old Testament texts in verses 9 and 10. Just as he used the Gezerah Shoah method to link verses about a stone, he uses the exact same search engine method again.
Right.
But this time, the linking keyword is people, which is laos in Greek. He pulls together 3 distinct Old Testament passages that use the word people to describe the nation of Israel, and he applies them directly to his Christian audience.
Let's examine the first text he pulls in for the second section, which is from Exodus 19.5 to 6.
Okay.
This is the monumental moment at Mount Sinai. God has just brought Israel out of 400 years of slavery in Egypt. They are gathered at the base of the mountain, and he offers them a covenant.
A huge moment in history.
He gives them these famous, weighty titles: a royal priesthood, a holy nation.
But when we look at the original Old Testament context, there is a very specific, terrifying condition attached to those titles. They didn't just get them automatically.
Indeed, the context of Exodus 19 is highly conditional. It is based on a suzerain-vassal treaty structure, which was common in the ancient world.
How did that treaty work?
God tells the Israelites that if they obey his voice and keep his covenant, then they will be his treasured possession out of all the nations. They will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
So it depended entirely on them.
It is a future potential based entirely on their ongoing obedience to the law given at Sinai.
But Peter changes something when he writes to the church.
Yes. When Peter takes this ancient text and applies it to the church, he makes a massive structural alteration. He changes the future, conditional tense, to a present, absolute reality.
He drops the if.
He drops it completely. He writes to these struggling believers, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. He completely removes the if and the will be.
Why does he have the authority to do that?
Because believers already possess this status through the new covenant. And that covenant was sealed not by their own perfect obedience to the law, but by Christ's blood. The perfect obedience required by the Sinai covenant was fulfilled by Jesus, and that fulfillment is legally credited to the believer.
So the condition has been met by Jesus.
Exactly. Therefore, the conditional titles of the Old Testament become the guaranteed present reality for the church.
I want to look closer at one specific phrase from that Exodus quote, royal priesthood.
Okay, let's dive into that.
In English, we read that as an adjective modifying a noun. We picture a priesthood that just happens to be royal.
Right, like priests who wear crowns or something.
But Glenny's analysis of the Greek phrase basilean hieratuma suggests something much more specific. He argues it's better understood as 2 distinct nouns joined together.
Yes, that is a huge point.
Which paints a totally different picture for the reader. What does Glenny say about this?
Based on the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that Peter and his readers used, and the broader usage of these terms in antiquity, Glenny argues that basilean hieratuma should be understood as a royal residence and a body of priests.
A royal residence and a body of priests.
This is a crucial distinction that expands the theology of the passage. The term royal residence connects back to verse 5, where Peter calls believers a spiritual house.
So the believers themselves are the structure.
Yes. The church itself is the actual dwelling place of the king. It is where God resides on earth via the Holy Spirit.
And what about the body of priests?
The phrase body of priests indicates that every single individual believer acts as a functioning priest within that residence.
That was not the case in the Old Testament, was it?
No, in the Old Testament system, the priesthood was strictly restricted. It was limited to one specific tribe, the Levites.
And even then it was limited.
Right. Within that tribe, only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies once a year. The access was heavily guarded.
But Peter's saying that has changed.
But in the New Testament escalation, the entire community of believers constitutes the priesthood. Every Christian has direct, unhindered access to God and is called to offer spiritual sacrifices.
That is just incredible.
The architectural and tribal restrictions of the Old Covenant have been completely shattered.
That means there is no need for a specialized human mediator anymore. You, the listener, have direct access to the throne room of the universe.
It is a massive privilege.
That is the privilege of being part of this new body of priests. Moving to the next quote in Peter's sequence, He brings in Isaiah 43.3021.
Right.
Here we find the concept of a chosen people whose specific task is to declare God's praises. In Isaiah, God is speaking to a nation in exile in Babylon.
A very dark time for Israel.
They have lost their temple, their city, and their freedom, and God is promising them a second exodus.
Isaiah 43 is a magnificent promise of redemption out of a seemingly hopeless situation.
God promises to rescue them again.
God is prophesying that he will deliver Israel from their bitter captivity in Babylon, just as he miraculously delivered them from Egypt centuries before.
He calls it a new thing, right?
He says he is doing a new thing, making a way in the wilderness and bringing water to the desert so that his chosen people can declare his praise.
And how does Peter use that for the church?
Peter takes this vivid imagery of physical, geographical deliverance from Babylon and escalates it to describe the Christian's spiritual deliverance.
So they have been rescued from something worse.
Christians have been rescued out of the ultimate exile, moral, and spiritual darkness. And the purpose of this deliverance is identical to the pattern in Isaiah.
To declare his praise.
To proclaim God's excellencies. But Peter specifies what this means in the context of the New Covenant. The church's task is to verbally and practically broadcast the saving acts of God to the surrounding pagan world.
It's an outward focus.
It is an active, ongoing witness. The community exists to make known the mercy they have received from the King.
And that concept of receiving mercy leads right into the most dramatic, scandalous imagery in the entire section.
It really is scandalous.
Peter alludes to the opening chapters of the prophet Hosea. For those who don't know the story, it is shocking. God commands Hosea to marry a woman named Gomer, knowing she will become unfaithful to him.
He literally tells him to marry a prostitute.
Yes. Hosea's painful, humiliating marriage is used as a living, breathing metaphor for God's relationship with the nation of Israel.
Right.
Israel has been spiritually unfaithful, chasing after false gods and foreign alliances. So God tells disobedient Israel, through the names of Hosea's children, "You are not my people, and I am not your God."
He literally names one of the children Lo-Ami,
which translates to "not my people." It is a devastating covenantal divorce. The relationship is severed.
It feels like the absolute end.
But the story doesn't end in that dark place, does it?
No, it does not. And that is the glory of the text. The central theme of the book of Hosea is God's fierce, relentless, pursuing love.
God doesn't give up on them.
Despite Israel's gross unfaithfulness, God promises a future day of incredible, unmerited mercy. He promises that in the very place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," they will be called children of the living God.
It is a complete reversal.
He will take those who had not received mercy and shower them with mercy. It is a trajectory moving from total alienation and judgment to complete reconciliation and restoration.
And Peter applies this to his Gentile readers.
Peter takes this deeply Jewish narrative of covenantal judgment and restoration and applies it directly to the Gentiles in his audience.
That is brilliant.
This is brilliant because these Gentiles were literally never part of God's covenant people. They were historically outside the promises, dead in their trespasses.
They were truly not a people.
Yet, through the work of Christ, they have been brought inside. The application fits them perfectly.
That brings up a concept Glenny focuses on, which he calls the eschatological now.
Ah, yes. The eschatological now.
Peter sets up this massive contrast for his readers. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy.
Right.
He is stressing the absolute night and day difference between the listeners' past darkness and their present reality. The arrival of Jesus Christ has triggered a new age.
The now is heavily emphasized by Peter.
It is not just a chronological shift on a calendar. It is a fundamental change in their very nature and their legal standing before the Creator.
The term eschatological now signifies that the long-awaited promises of salvation, the events that the prophets thought would happen at the very end of time, have broken into the present moment.
The end times have started early.
The future age has arrived in the person and work of Jesus, and believers are currently experiencing the spiritual realities of that new age.
They don't have to wait.
They do not have to wait for the final day of history to become God's people. They possess that status fully and completely in the present.
That brings immense comfort.
This brings immense comfort to a suffering church. Their external circumstances might look bleak. They might be facing trial, poverty, and isolation. But their internal covenantal reality is completely secure.
Their identity is locked in.
They have received mercy, And that mercy defines their existence, not the oppression of the Roman world.
So what does this all mean? We have reached the most controversial part of our deep dive.
Yes, we have.
We have laid out all the data, and now we have to address the central question of Glenny's essay. If the church is now called a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and God's own people, all titles originally given to ethnic Israel at Sinai, has God permanently cast aside the Jewish people?
This is the big debate.
Does the Christian church entirely replace the physical nation of Israel in God's redemptive plan? This view is often called supersessionism or replacement theology, and it is a massive debate that affects everything from theology to modern geopolitics.
It touches everything.
Based on Glenny's careful analysis of how Peter is using the Old Testament, what is the conclusion?
The conclusion, based firmly on Glenny's typological-prophetic analysis, is that the church does not replace Israel.
Okay, that is a vital distinction.
This is a vital distinction to maintain. Peter is using Israel's history as a pattern, a blueprint for understanding the church's spiritual relationship with God.
But using a blueprint doesn't destroy the original building.
But utilizing a pattern does not mean you obliterate the original subject of that pattern.
Right.
We have to look closely at how the concept of fulfillment operates in Peter's logic.
Right.
Glenny points out a crucial difference between the fulfillment we see with the stone passages and the fulfillment we see with the people passages.
Okay, let's break that down, because that sounds like the key to solving the puzzle.
Right.
What is the fundamental difference between the stone fulfillment and the people fulfillment?
With the stone passages, Jesus is the final and exhaustive fulfillment of those prophecies.
There's nothing left to fulfill.
There will never be another Messiah. There will never be another cornerstone laid in Zion. The divine pattern reaches its absolute terminal peak in him.
But the people prophecies are different.
However, the church's fulfillment of the people prophecies is different. The church is the initial fulfillment of these promises, but it is not the exhaustive final fulfillment.
Initial versus final.
Right. The church is experiencing the spiritual blessings of the new covenant right now, having been grafted in, but that does not cancel out the specific, literal promises God made to the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
That is a weighty claim. What evidence does Glenny provide from the text or from Peter's broader theology to prove that there is still a future restoration for ethnic Israel?
He gives some very solid evidence.
Why can't we just say the church is the new Israel, the old promises are spiritualized, and call it a day?
Glenny provides two very strong lines of evidence to counter that idea. The first is a logical argument based on the concept of election,
Which we discussed earlier.
which, as we discussed, is the very hinge of Peter's entire passage. If God's election of Israel could be permanently revoked, if God could simply change his mind and throw away the people he swore an eternal covenant to, then Peter's argument in this letter completely collapses.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Remember, Peter is writing to comfort a persecuted church by telling them their election is secure. He is essentially saying, look at Israel. See how God chose them. You are chosen like that.
Right.
But if God's choice of Israel was temporary and voidable, then the church's election is also temporary and voidable.
That destroys the comfort.
A revoked promise offers zero comfort to someone facing the lions. For the church to have unshakable confidence in God's promises, God must remain faithful to his original promises to ethnic Israel. The gifts and calling of God must be irrevocable, or the entire system falls apart.
Wow. If God can break his promise to Israel, he can break his promise to you.
Yeah.
That logic is unshakable.
It really is.
If the pattern is God chooses a people and keeps them despite their rebellion, you need the original people to actually be kept in the end. Otherwise, the pattern is just a theory.
Exactly. I mean, that is the whole point of election.
What is the second piece of evidence Glenny brings to the table to support a future for Israel?
The second piece of evidence comes from Peter's own words, recorded in the book of Acts.
Okay, looking outside the letter.
In Acts chapter 3, verses 19 through 21, Peter is preaching a sermon to a Jewish audience in Jerusalem right after a miraculous healing.
Right.
He tells them to repent and turn to God, and he speaks about a future time when Jesus will return from heaven. Peter says that heaven must receive Jesus until the time comes for God to restore everything, as he promised long ago through his holy prophets.
Restore everything.
The Greek word used for restore is apokatastasis. This specific term is heavily loaded with Jewish expectations regarding the future, physical restoration of the Davidic kingdom, and the gathering of the nation of Israel back to their land.
Oh, so it's a very specific phrase.
Peter is explicitly stating, after the birth of the church at Pentecost, that there is still a future, comprehensive restoration coming that will fulfill the ancient prophecies made to Israel.
The story isn't over.
The church age is a glorious reality, but it has not exhausted the prophetic timeline laid out in the Old Testament.
So to summarize this typological view, God operates in recurring, escalating patterns throughout human history.
Yes.
The church right now is experiencing the spiritual realities of the new covenant. We have the Holy Spirit, we have direct access to the throne room, we are a holy nation and a royal priesthood.
All true right now.
But this current spiritual reality does not erase the literal geographic and national promises God made to ethnic Israel for the future. The single-story house is still part of the master plan, even while the skyscraper is dominating the skyline.
That is the big idea right there. The typological-prophetic method protects the integrity of the Old Testament text.
It doesn't spiritualize everything away.
It respects the historical reality of Israel and the literal promises made to them, while simultaneously celebrating the massive, escalated inclusion of the Gentiles into the spiritual blessings of the covenant.
So it's a both-hand situation.
It is a both-hand scenario, not an either replacement. Peter's brilliance is in showing these marginalized, suffering Gentile believers that they have been grafted into a massive ancient story of redemption.
Without pushing the original actors off the stage.
Right, without needing to claim that the original participants in that story have been permanently discarded.
That brings us to our closing thoughts for this deep dive. Let's recap the main takeaways.
It's been a lot of ground to cover.
It has. Peter brilliantly layered Old Testament texts using rabbinic methods like Gezerah Shawa to speak to a hurting, persecuted group of Gentile believers.
Yes.
He showed them that their status is eternally secure. They are built on the ultimate tested stone, Jesus Christ. Because they are united with him, they have stepped into the historical pattern of God's chosen people.
They share in all of it.
They hold supreme honor, they are a royal priesthood with direct access to God, and they are tasked with verbally proclaiming the mercy they have received out of darkness.
And they possess all of this right now.
They possess it right now, in the eschatological now, even while the Roman world rejects them.
And critically, this incredible transfer of spiritual privilege to the church relies entirely on the faithfulness of God.
Because his promises are good.
His refusal to abandon his covenant promises to ethnic Israel is the very bedrock that guarantees he will never abandon his church. The patterns hold true because the architect's character does not change.
Which leaves us with a final idea to ponder. We have seen how God takes a pattern and escalates it.
We have.
We have seen how the church is the initial fulfillment of these ancient promises, a global preview of God's mercy and spiritual restoration.
Just a preview.
But if what we are experiencing right now in the worldwide church is just the initial fulfillment, what will the world look like when the final fulfillment arrives? What will it be like when the pattern reaches its absolute peak for all people, when the king physically returns and restores everything as promised by the prophets?
That is something to think about.
If the preview is this glorious, the finale will be unimaginable. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Keep seeking the patterns in the text, and we will see you next time.